A few days before The Order 1886 came out, a leaked playthrough of the game's entirety was uploaded to YouTube, revealing a short campaign length of around 5 hours. Later on, users reported an average of a couple hours longer, but either way, 5 or 7 hours, that's still a pretty short game. And that cued a wave of angry controversy and snarky jokes over just what modern developers are getting away with these days when making yet another short cinematic experience. You know the kind that compromises gameplay with low frame rates and long cutscenes and is all over and done with in one evening. But that's not new. That's been business as usual since the advent of the CD-ROM. 15 years ago, I found myself beating Metal Gear Solid the same night I brought it home from Blockbuster. It was a very different economy back then, but these short, cinematic games full of cutscenes and letterboxing and gameplay compromises are decades old. Keep in mind that I haven't played The Order, and I don't have a PS4, but last week I did play through RE2 from 1998, and after beating it, it said I lasted about 4.5 hours. And The Order 1886 is supposedly 7 hours. This isn't new. Games of this length will probably always appeal to older demographics with less time and money, and the rental market, but one thing that will almost always appeal to anyone is just a damn good game. And I don't really think that short game length can keep a good game from happening. Thanks to my infinite wisdom and expertise, I've identified 3 ways that developers can mitigate, and maybe even straight up take advantage of, a short length game. Sure, you can beat Resident Evil 2 in 4.5 hours, but you're not really done with it at that point, and you're doing yourself a real disservice if you toss it away afterwards. Resident Evil has one of my favorite gimmicks for encouraging replayability. You have 2 different campaigns between your 2 playable characters. You see the same events through 2 different perspectives, with different bosses, different areas, and a different story each time. So you really gotta play through it twice to see everything. And in RE2, the order you play through these 2 campaigns changes things further. The decisions you make with one character can be stored on a save game and loaded up with the other. So to really see everything, you have to play through it 4 times. And each time you do, you reveal little hints that unlock new bits of extra content. New weapons and new costumes are just, whatever. But if you finish the campaign with a high enough rank, you unlock entire new gameplay modes. So before you know it, you have this menagerie of wacky alternate challenges and scenarios that really stretch the limits of what they could do with the small amount of levels they had. Awesome. RE2 was the directorial debut of Hideki Kamiya, whose career and studios are associated with a lot of very short but very replayable and very highly reviewed games. Games like Devil May Cry, Beautiful Joe, Mad World, Vanquish, and Metal Gear Rising are probably going to take about 5 to 7 hours your first time through, but they all embrace New Game Plus modes as well as alternate scenarios, difficulties, and score-driven unlock stores that are designed to encourage multiple playthroughs. So you beat the game, and find out you can do it again, but this time faster, better, stronger, and harder, and it'll only take a few hours. This isn't as easily accomplishable in a longer game. Not only is a second playthrough of these games less of a time commitment, but their shorter lengths also allow developers to focus more on why they want to play it again and again, rather than just once. The harder difficulty modes of these already hard games don't just ramp up enemy health and damage, they also change enemy placement, player upgrades, and they impose new tactical rules. They're designed to teach the player high-level play, so that players can know how satisfying it is to breeze through old challenges in seconds that had them previously stuck for hours, even when the enemies hit harder and the game moves faster. The end result is an amazing power trip, and gameplay that is nuanced enough to make that happen, and the player doesn't have to set aside months to achieve that incredible feeling of accomplishment. Awesome! There are a lot of different ways developers define fun. Here's one that includes time. This equation claims that fun games have to strike a balance between decisions and time, which would mean it's no coincidence that my previous examples of great short games all happen to be fast-paced action games and not slow-paced RPGs. The overall length of their campaigns, their stories, and their levels are designed for gameplay that has the player deciding between about 10 inputs on a frame-by-frame basis. In those games, 1 second of sloppy play can make a huge difference. Compare that to a turn-based strategy game like Civ, where players have to choose between tens of buildings across a handful of cities with unlimited little variations in micromanagement within each one, but they have unlimited time to make those decisions. Bayonetta is pretty long for a character action beat-em-up, and it averages about 11 hours. Civ 5, on the other hand, can last anywhere from 29 to 553 hours, depending on the player's engagement. Remember Portal? That game was about 3 hours, and it's also the first game in recent memory that I remember being praised for being short. It's an intriguing, funny story that begins and ends before the player can forget what's going on. Every new twist to the Portal puzzles is used just once or twice before a new twist is introduced. It's all killer, no filler, with drastically more complex puzzles and drastically different scenery in the second half, when the tension in the story ramps way up. It's only as long as it possibly could have been, and people loved it for that. Shorter games allow developers to trim off repetition and filler, resulting in games with tighter design, more visually polished areas, and a higher variety of experiences coming to the player faster. Optimizing their effort over a small amount of content also means that developers can make short games more polished and more thoroughly play-tested to ensure that everything's working as intended. And even then, if something doesn't work, it's not gonna overstay its welcome. Time is money, and you get what you pay for. If there isn't much time to risk, then shorter games are going to be able to get away with compromises longer games can't. They're better suited to experiment, they're better suited to explore a novelty, to try something weird and see how it performs, before exhausting all the value out of that novelty. And this is where short games don't necessarily have to be well-polished or fast-paced to succeed, as long as they do a good job exploring something that might grind on in a longer game. It can be a dazzling art style, a witty and entertaining script, or just a new gameplay feature that isn't particularly deep and satisfying, but fun and meaningful to experience just once. Like, say, running away in first person from monsters you can't fight, and using stealth to evade them while solving puzzles. Amnesia and Outlast did that stuff for 5 to 8 hours and they were just $20 at launch, but when Creative Assembly decided to stretch that kind of gameplay out to 18 hours and charge $60 for Alien Isolation, reviewers panned it for feeling too long and drawn out. As it turns out, those monsters get a whole lot less scary after so many hours of learning their tricks. It probably would have fared better as a shorter game, and as with any product, if the price was lower. Experimenting with non-traditional price-to-content ratios is something indie developers figured out years ago, but AAA still has difficulty charging less money for less time. But there are exceptions. Like Portal. That game experimented both with its short 2-hour length, but also with its inclusion in a bundle, or as a $20 standalone. Ground Zeroes was either $30, $40, or $20 depending on your platform, and the whole idea of the product was this weird experimental focus test to gauge fan feedback for a different game. So there are 3 clear advantages to brevity here: replayability, pacing, and experimentation. And from what I'm hearing from reviews, the Order 1886 has none of those. As it turns out, a $60 7-hour cover shooter riddled with hacking minigames and QTEs that fails to innovate nor deliver any kind of replay value did not sit well with reviewers, even though it may look very, very pretty. Maybe those 3 qualities are what make the difference between a game that feels short versus a game that feels incomplete. Here's a game that was panned for being short. Here's a game that was panned for being too long. Here's a game that was praised for being incredibly long, and here's a game that was praised for being incredibly short. Maybe the raw value of their length matters less to reviewers than whether or not they're well designed for their length. Time is money, and it's not easy striking the balance between the two. 60 hours is going to seem longer to someone with less free time, in the same way that $60 is going to seem more valuable to someone with less money. The value of a game's length is going to change, depending on who you ask and what they're playing. The reason people continue to argue about game length is the same reason people argue about review scores. It's easy. It's just about a number. That number breaks down all the complicated subjective highs, lows, and uncertainties of the experience into just 1 or 2 digits. It's a number that's going to mean incredibly different things to different people, which is why it's important that we remember that a game's length is just one of many, many factors that can determine its quality or its success.